it's believed that their descendants are the fairy folk. And the way that they keep in touch with our world is with trees, with fairy rings, fairy forts, and mounds.
This is The Butterfly Effect, a podcast that shows the big impact a small action can do. Tali Orad is talking to those special people that make a difference with nature and trees.
Welcome everyone to The Butterfly Effect. My name is Tali Orad. I'm your host and your butterfly here. Today I'm excited to have a fellow podcaster and an activist on the show, Ceara Carney. Ceara is a 27-year-old activist and actor from Dublin, Ireland. She grew up in the countryside and has been passionate about the environment and animal rights from a young age. Her eyes were opened to the deforestation and pollutions happening on the mass scale after being vegetarian and vegan for many years and being conscious of what she consumes. She involved with activist group Extinction Rebellion in Ireland and is also the host of an eco-friendly living podcast, The Book of Leaves. Welcome, Ceara, to The Butterfly Effect.
Thank you so much for having me, Tali. I'm so excited to be on the other side of the microphone for once, and I'm a big fan of your podcast, so thank you.
I gave a brief introduction of you. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. Yeah, the podcast is something that is a big hobby of mine. I spend so much time on it. I love doing that. And then when I'm not working my real person jobs or acting jobs, I just seem to be protesting all the time.
You were born and raised in Ireland, and Ireland is known to be country steeped in mythology. And when I think of Irish folklore, I imagine fairies, leprechauns, and people gathering around to share stories. Many tales and legends were passed from generation to generation, and I'm assuming via those gatherings. And I personally love hearing stories like that. And maybe I'm presumptuous, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure you know them. And as this podcast is about nature, maybe you can share one about trees?
Sure, you're dead right. Ireland is absolutely steeped in mythology and fairies. We have the image of Ireland is a very green, lush country. But as serious as we are, even present day, there's a lot of superstitions and we have a lot of fairy tales that we just kind of respect nature. We leave nature be in certain cases anyway, not all the time, but basically years and years ago, we're talking thousands of years ago, the first kind of gods that roamed this land were called the Tuatha De Danann. They were just mighty powerful beings and they had big wars and they were eventually banished from the land when the first Gaelics arrived to Ireland in around 11th century AD. And when these people arrived that had been traveling the earth for years, they arrived and they decided between the Tuatha De Danann and the new Gaelics that the Tuatha De Danann they would split Ireland in half, and Tuatha De Danann would go to the underworld, the other side, and these Gaelics would then roam Ireland. So basically, you have the Tuatha De Danann who are living in a parallel universe to us, and it's believed that their descendants are the fairy folk. And the way that they keep in touch with our world is with trees, with fairy rings, fairy forts, and mounds. So you'll find fairy trees and rings near holy wells and a lot of places of Christian significance in Ireland because that's originally where pagans were. And you will find that these places have just such high levels of superstition because this is where the fairies live. The Tuatha De Danann, their ancestors are
Mm-hmm.
known as the fairies. They live here, and if you mess with the trees, you're basically you're asking for really really bad luck. So people tend to leave these sites alone because the fairies otherwise will put a curse on you. And there's lots of famous fairies. You mentioned one of them, the leprechaun. He's quite a feisty fairy. You've another fairy called the Banshee, who is known to wail and basically give warning if someone's going to pass away in your family. And if you see her,
Hmm.
it means you're going to pass away. So they're quite scary. They're not like the normal Hollywood fairies. The Irish fairies
Wow.
are scary business, but they chose to live in the trees and specifically hawthorn trees. So if you have a tree, a hawthorn tree, standing alone in the middle of a field or on the side of the road, it is most likely a fairy tree. And especially on Halloween, when the barrier between our world and the fairy world is the weakest, you would stay away from that tree.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a
and
lot.
and people actually believe those superstitions and stay away from those trees?
Yeah, now in the city, I'm in the capital of Ireland now, which is Dublin. So it's a big city, and you wouldn't find there'd be no fairy trees and very few fairy rings, if any, that I know of. But the further out into the countryside you go, people do believe them. They might not admit it out loud, but at the same time, if you said to someone, "Okay, then go up and cut a branch off that fairy tree," they wouldn't do it. They just don't mess with it because some things happen that you just can't explain. And there was one tree that people were so upset. Some people were upset because they were trying to cut it down to build something, and someone came with a chainsaw. No one knows who this person was, and cut all the branches off. So all that was left was the stump, and everyone thought it was going to die. They couldn't find the person who did it, and some
Hmm.
people think that person was taken away by the fairies. That's why they couldn't find them. But the tree survived. The tree grew all its branches back and now it looks completely normal again. So yeah, even though, we've all got our phones and we're all super tech, like super high tech now, you still don't mess with a fairy tree. You just don't, because they're really scary.
Yeah. And the hawthorn is a small tree, right? It's a bushy tree which grows not so high, and it also survived for many years, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. They just look like wild bushes, like their blossoms were thought to be poisonous, and it turns out they actually found that there is a similar chemical in the blossoms of a hawthorn that is found in decaying flesh. So they actually think that
Wow.
there is something kind of ringing true when people thought the blossoms were unlucky.
Wow. So consider yourself warned, people.
Yeah. Now, farmers who have trees on their land, they think that if they leave the tree alone, the fairies will bring them good luck. So if you're good to the fairies, they'll be good to you. That's kind of how it works.
There was a big story recently in Ireland with that tree, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we have motorways. I think you might call them highways in America. And this was in 1999. They wanted to build this motorway, and it took them 10 years because
Wow.
there was a fairy tree in the way that the county council in Clare said this has to be protected, and they spent millions of euro, millions of euro diverting the motorway around this one fairy tree so that it wouldn't be destroyed, because you have a fairy expert in Ireland who said if this is destroyed, everyone working on the construction will have bad luck and the motorway could very well possibly lead, like, be high rate for casualties for accidents. So that's like an
Wow.
actual case where the government in Ireland spent money, millions of euro, to divert from destroying a fairy tree.
I personally appreciate that because no matter what the reason, if you preserve nature, I'm up for it. And if it's in the culture, it's even better, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is the hawthorn the only tree in the fairy tales that.
No, so you find it's usually either a hawthorn or an ash tree would be a fairy tree. Ash tree is also very well known in Ireland because its wood supplies our hurleys, and we use hurleys for our sports here. There are two sports that originated in Ireland: Gaelic football and Gaelic hurling. And
Mhm.
hurling is was described by an Australian journalist as a mixture of hockey and death. So if you imagine hockey but with wooden sticks and you're hitting a leather ball with no guards on you except for a helmet, and you basically
Yeah.
have to hit it into a goal or over the goal post, like pretty much like an American football, and the sticks need to be really, really strong but also kind of flexible so that they can, hit a hard leather ball at speed. And the ash tree is used for that, although unfortunately now we do have very little ash trees left in Ireland, that we import a lot of ash wood from Scandinavia. So,
Hmm.
as much as the fairy tales preserve the odd lone fairy tree here and there, unfortunately, there's still a lot of deforestation that's after happening in Ireland.
You are now involved with an organization that is trying to bring back all those native trees to Ireland, right?
Yeah, so Ireland has one of the lowest forestry covers in Europe. We have 11% forestry cover, and only 2% of that is native. The other 9 is an invasive species called Sitka spruce, which is grown here for production. We use it for
Hmm.
paper, and it's because it's non-native, it needs pesticides to grow, and the forest floor is completely bare. If you walk through a Sitka spruce forest, there's just no life. It doesn't support anything. So we have a huge problem in that we are lacking proper forestry cover, and the government said they'll come out and plant more trees. And the trees that they wanted to plant were Sitka spruce. So,
Ouch.
with Extinction Rebellion, a lot of activists, we don't just do direct action protests and marches on the street. There's also a lot of activists who set up initiatives.
Hmm.
There's a group of activists who's taken it upon themselves to raise money to plant trees on land that anyone has anywhere across the land. So basically, they're fundraising at the moment and looking for people who have land to start planting those trees so we can get more forest back, because yeah, it's needed obviously for the climate change, and but also for biodiversity. And it's more beautiful because unfortunately a lot of our land are just grasslands for feeding our dairy and beef cattle.
One fascinating thing that I've learned about Ireland when I was researching before we spoke is that there is a big connection with nature, with obviously the fairies, but even the letters in the Ogham alphabet, which is an early medieval alphabet that is kind of like the base for the Irish language, is the first form of writing ever used in the Irish language, and they are named after trees. So for me, that conflict of this is a nation that is so connected to trees will go, and on one hand, there will be a lot of superstitious, and on the other hand, we'll cut them down. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right. Our first known written language is called Ogham. I know there's a G in the middle. The Irish language is
Oh my
it's
God.
very complicated. A G and a H is silent together. I know it's very funny, but yeah, this language, it's basically a vertical line, and you make notches either side of the line, and each about half of the letters are all named after trees. And I think, as with most places, just over time in this capitalist society that we're in, our aims and our focuses and what's really important just shifts, and all of a sudden it's not the connection to the land that matters anymore. It's what you can get from the land and what the land can give you. And
Right.
this is obviously happening all over the world, and why climate change is such an issue, because we kind of lost that connection to the land a lot. But this is where I think art and activism and education and podcasts like yours and this one, like getting to more people and getting to more ears and reminding people just to come back and connect to the land. We have such a strong connection to nature when you acknowledge it and when you kind of look inside yourself. And everyone in Ireland has that, but we just, especially if you're in the city, you forget about it, and it's not something they teach you in schools that much either. So I think it's really important, if there's teachers listening or parents, start with the kids. Because my mom, that's something she did. She always reminded me that nature was alive. My half sister used to tease her for when she wanted to climb a tree. My mom would say, "Now ask the tree's permission first." And my sister thought that was so funny, and my mom was a bit kooky, but that's what I grew up with. And my mom teaching me these things and telling me about the fairies and how they'll protect the house if, we're good to them and good to the land. That, yeah, that just kind of never went away. So I think, what you tell your kids is important in the little ones in your life. And then as an adult, it's never too late to reawaken that. So yeah, I love art that brings us out of people, conversations and all sorts. Like, it is possible to get that connection again.
Yeah, I totally agree. And is you do not study that culture in school? You don't learn of those tales at school just from your parents?
You would learn a little bit. You'd learn mostly Irish myths. We've got famous stories about Cuchulainn, this strong warrior. We've got the children of Lear, some children who were turned into swans. You get these kind of stories, but they're very much told as myths. Um,
Right.
and they'll tell you about Newgrange, this amazing monument we have that's older than the pyramids, and no one can really explain how it was built, because once a year on the winter solstice, the sunlight enters the chamber, and they just don't know how they had the technology to do that. But they just kind of tell you that, and then they don't really go into, but what happens, what really does happen if we do get rid of all the trees, if we do get rid of all the fairy rings that exist? Well, that's taking away nature, and that will affect us. So whether or not you believe in fairies, something bad will happen if you take away all those trees. So yeah, they don't really teach you so much in school. I definitely had more of it from my parents and from the art that I saw, like films that I watched, movies about fairies or forests and nature. Like that really fascinated me, and I think that's why I kind of went into the arts industry then as well, because I knew you can make a difference with art that you make. You don't need to write a book necessarily. You can also entertain and teach people at the same time.
Right. And I think that's what you do with the podcast, right? The Book of Leaves. You try to bring that knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. With Book of Leaves, I basically just wanted to highlight the people in Ireland that are doing good things, because the planet, as we all know, needs a lot of help right now to reverse the damage that we've done. And I just wanted to show that there are people in Ireland who have really good ideas, and they're working on tree planting programs, or they're rescuing seals, or they're just living a zero waste life at home. And the whole idea is I interview them, talk about their story, about why they started living that way, or what opened their eyes, I guess. And then we
Hmm.
take a leaf out of their book to add to our own way of eco friendly living. But I do find I am fascinated by what I call the ripple effect. So, what it was that triggered them to be environmentally conscious. The butterfly effect is very similar. Something
Right.
small that you do could have an impact like so far away, and most of the time you won't see it. So I interview people and they're telling me, "Oh yes, it was my teacher who told me this," or "Oh, it was when I saw this documentary." And how many people are told, "Oh yes, you changed my life." You don't always go up to someone and be like, "Oh, hey Tally, when I heard your podcast, I completely stopped cutting down trees and now got a little forest in my garden." People don't tell you, so you never know the power that you have as one individual. And I think I love, like you, I just love hearing what it was about people that inspired them, that triggered them to kind of start caring and preserving and being a guardian of the earth rather than a taker.
And what was your moment?
Oh. So I was always very much in tune with nature and and animals growing up. I think I definitely grew up with just a love of animals that at the age of 10 I was like I can't eat them anymore. So I went vegetarian. My parents thought it would be a phase, and it wasn't. So I went vegetarian first, but it wasn't until when a friend of mine said, because initially I was vegetarian for the animals first, and a friend of mine said what they heard or what they saw on their friend's dairy farm, which was basically a cow that had been taken from his mother because the calves obviously drink the milk and they need to be separated so they're not drinking the milk that is sold to us. And the calf wasn't taken so well. So he was really sick. And my friend, who was visiting her friend's farm, was asking if there's anything they could do about it. And he said no, he probably won't make the night. And when my friend told me that story, I was eating like a chocolate muffin and drinking like a milky hot chocolate at the time, and
Ouch.
I was just like, oh my gosh. So, and that night I went home and I had like a dream about a cow, and I was like, oh god, I can't. So it was basically then I decided to go vegan, and then from there I started watching more documentaries about the environment, trees, and fast fashion, and there's just a whole environmentalist kind of aspect of me was just triggered, and yeah, I haven't looked back. It was that little story that kind of triggered the environmental activist that's in me now, and since then I just keep learning things from other people. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of films I think really inspired me as a child. I was obsessed with Cinderella, who could talk to animals. There's this film called Fern Gully about cutting down a forest, about trees having life, and that really, really inspired me. And yeah, the Fox and the Hound, another Disney film as well about animals. I was just convinced animals could talk. They just weren't talking when I was around. So definitely films had a big influence on me as well.
So Disney and not the Irish culture?
No. Yeah, big props to Walt Disney there for all the inspiration. Yeah, no, fairies, I think, and the leprechauns. There's just a magicalness about the Irish countryside that you can't always explain, and I was aware of that. Definitely, and I was convinced I had fairies living in my garden, and I'd be nice to them, and you'd go out and you'd leave little gifts. I was obsessed. I loved it. So yeah. But even as an adult I kind of lost that. I moved to the city and forgot about the fairies for a while. Until I'd go back to the countryside and remember I'd have to behave.
Will you ever go back to leave them gifts when
Yeah.
you go out?
If I'm out, if you Sam, this is for anyone listening as well. If you're ever in Ireland and you find yourself at a fairy tree or a fairy ring, which is basically it could be a circle of stones or a circle of mushrooms, and there'll be a bare patch in the middle where nothing grows. Don't go inside the fairy ring. Leave the fairy home alone, but you can leave gifts if you like. Leave some flowers. You can leave. Some people used to leave money for good luck.
Mhm.
But yeah, you don't go inside the fairy ring. That's very bad luck.
So the fairy ring is where they live, or that's the portal?
They're both the same. They're seen to be the fairy rings and fairy mounds are seen more to be portals, and trees are kind of both. They're kind of the home of the fairies, but also portals into their side, the other world. So
Wow.
yeah, you'll hear like they're more less fairy tales and more characters. They're more specific fairies that do, certain things like leprechauns hiding
Yeah.
treasure away from people. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. And I'd love us all just to go back to just to respecting fairies and building more homes for them.
So it's mostly to scare people, right? If I'm getting all the examples right?
Yeah,
Or do you
well,
have
they
other things?
just yeah, they no, they seem like they're just The fairies will protect you. If you leave them alone, they will protect you. And a farmer who has a fairy tree on their land won't touch that fairy tree and will sometimes leave offerings, might leave food, bread, cheese, or any, it could be even clothes, anything at all they could
Hmm.
leave at the tree. And if you're good to the fairies, they'll be good to you and it'll bring good luck on you. But most of the fairies, they're all quite bad and they're all quite scary. Definitely not like normal fairy tales.
Well, if it helps save the environment. Again, I
Exactly.
don't mind.
Yeah.
What is your favorite tree?
Oh, I love this question. Okay, so I mean, there is obviously the hawthorn tree is a really cool tree because it's always home to fairies. But I actually have one specific tree that, very like your previous listeners, has got to do with my childhood. It's a chestnut tree,
Hmm.
horse chestnut tree that grows in the estate that I grew up in. My estate is called Caston Close, which is Irish for chestnut close. It was named after
Hmm.
this huge tree that we used to play in. I used to climb, I used to sit in it reading. I love this tree. And then at autumn, all the conkers would be on the ground, and that was hours of entertainment. We planted daffodils at the bottom of the tree, and then I had a dog that used to love chasing cars out on the road, and we buried his collar at this tree when he died. So I have this one soft spot for this particular chestnut tree, and every time I go home, like it's a sign of home when I see that tree. So yeah, another childhood tree favorite.
That is beautiful. Now I have to ask, did you ask permission before you climbed it?
I think so. I'm pretty sure, and I definitely used to talk to the tree as well.
And how do you say tree in Irish?
The Irish for tree is crown. It's spelled Crann, but pronounced like, the crown that a king or queen would wear. So, and it's also similar to the word ceann, which is your head. So it's like your head, the tree. They're kind of both very smart and powerful. But yes, crown is tree.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Cara, for sharing with us all the culture and love for the environment.
No problem. Thank you so much. And just don't forget, if anyone's ever in Ireland, if you see a fairy tree or a fairy ring, just be wary, be nice, but don't go messing with it, or yeah, you might have bad luck.
Stay away.
Yeah.
Yes. And thank you, everyone, for joining me today. We are all beautiful butterflies, each in his and her individual ways. I wanted to thank you for joining me today in this episode. I really appreciate you coming on this journey with me, and I hope you can join me next time. And remember, it only takes a small action to make a big difference. Be a butterfly.
And that's all for this episode. Thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe to hear more of our stories of change.